This is Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM. I'm Siobhan Weed, and joining me today is Victoria Churchill, U.S. political reporter for the Daily Mail, here to talk about her recent coverage of the Michigan election results and what senatorial candidate Abdul El-Sayed's victory means for this fall's election. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, Siobhan. So great to be on with you.
So for listeners who haven't been following this race super closely, why is it that this Michigan Senate race suddenly has become such a big deal on the national scale?
Well, thank you so much for the question. It is definitely a race of national importance because currently Republicans have, just a handful of seats that determines their majority in the U.S. Senate, which I cover day to day. So, with the midterm elections coming up, there are, of course, the battleground seats all across the country. We're also looking at, for example, states like Maine, where Republican Susan Collins is trying to hold on to her seat. There's states like North Carolina, where Democrats are trying to pick up a seat. Mm-hmm. And, Michigan is one of these seats where you had a Democrat senator retire. You've had a Republican nominee in Mike Rogers, who got the Trump endorsement early on. Nobody really challenged him in the primary. He's been the presumptive nominee, became the fully fledged GOP nominee. So he's kind of been sitting on the sidelines, if you will, while Democrats have been battling it out. We've seen nationally this trend of more progressive candidates picking up seats that have been held by more moderate Democrats. We've seen this in states like New York City with a couple of their congressional districts. We've seen that in Colorado as well. But states like Michigan, there's long been this argument that Democrats there, as well as states like Minnesota and Wisconsin, that are also having, similar clashes among Democrats in their statewide elections, both for governor and for Senate, that, those states prefer more moderate candidates. And so there was this big fight in the primary between Haley Stevens, who is a current member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and then Abdul El-Sayed, who has, never held elected government office. He's previously ran for governor in Michigan, and then he's held two appointed positions as the director of health for the city of Detroit, as well as Wayne County. So he's been in the public eye in the political realm for a number of years, but he's never actually won, anything with his own name on the ballot. So, this was something that was, he had a lot of progressive backers from DC that were out stumping for him, campaigning with him, versus Stevens was the more moderate candidate. And, she, particularly on the issue of Israel, which is huge in national politics, Stevens is supportive of, U.S. support of Israel versus Abdul El-Sayed, who is also a Muslim himself, a son of Egyptian immigrants. Mm-hmm. He doesn't really like anything that the U.S. government has to do with Israel. So they made that a really big issue on the campaign, as well as taking dollars from corporate PACs. This is something that Stevens has done in her House races. So she continued to do that in the Senate race. Versus El-Sayed said, he was funded by people, not PACs. That was kind of a big part of his messaging in the primary.
Okay, yeah. I like that you brought up kind of this tension between, this Democratic split of the moderates, establishment Democratic Party versus these progressives. And Abdul El-Sayed would kind of fit into that latter sector of the Democratic Party. Do you think that his victory over Haley Stevens was more of kind of voters wanting the alternative to the Democratic establishment candidate? Or do you think it actually came from a true embrace of his particular platform and ideology?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think, again, he is not the first of this, of this wave, but he, I think, is definitely not going to be the last. We're seeing, for example, in states like Wisconsin, progressive challengers. So, there does seem to be an appetite for these less moderate candidates in the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. But I also think at the same time, most candidates that are tied to DC in a certain way are not being successful in their statewide races, which I think is also just part of the national attitude. Whether it's Republicans saying, you have a trifecta between Congress and the White House, both chambers of Congress and the White House. Why can't you get any legislation done? There's frustration from Republicans that are tied to DC, or with the representatives that are tied to DC. And then, for Democrats, they think that the Trump administration is doing too much and their current representatives in DC aren't doing enough to resist him. So, like I said, I think this is something we've seen play out, in Republican races. A couple of members of the House of Representatives have gone back to their home states and run for statewide office, and they haven't been very successful. So it really seems to be kind of an all across the board dislike or distrust of what they see going on in Washington, D.C. So I think all of those factors at play are, very important for going ahead and going for this national battle that we're watching.
This is Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM. Today we have on Victoria Churchill, U.S. political reporter for the Daily Mail, here to talk about her recent coverage of the Michigan election results. And now in your recent coverage of this this kind of whole situation, you described El-Sayed's primary victory as like potentially being this win for Republicans. Can you just kind of walk us through that paradox?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So, Republicans, I think, particularly in Michigan, have, been coalesced around Rogers. So they've been kind of biding their time, waiting for El-Sayed to become the nominee. And I think Republicans in a lot of these states are willing to make the argument that these Democrats that are winning, these more progressive Democrats, are, not in line with American values. This is an argument that people like President Trump are making as well. He had a post on Truth Social over the weekend where, he put himself and the First Lady and, a picture of El-Sayed and his wife. And, he presented that as two very different visions of America. And, he was ridiculed for that by some people. El-Sayed himself fought back against that narrative, but also kind of sort of agreed with it. He was like, well, under Donald Trump, XYZ things are going wrong in the country, versus with me and people like-minded people, those wouldn't be issues. It was kind of his pushback on that as well.
And then how much with Mike Rogers being kind of his opponent, how much do you think the Republican strategy is going to rely on kind of defining El-Sayed as this kind of extreme progressive rather than actually focusing on Mike Rogers?
I mean, I think defining the Democrats and particularly grouping them together, which, I think as these more progressive candidates win over their more establishment or more moderate counterparts, is going to be easier and easier for Republicans to do. National Republican Senatorial Chairman Tim Scott, he was doing the rounds on national news shows yesterday, and he was talking about how, for, to kind of present this image of tying people like El-Sayed even to other candidates that present themselves as more moderate, like James Talarico in Texas. So Republicans are definitely trying to group all of these progressive candidates together. I think kind of to their credit, that is an argument that is easier for them to do, particularly because a lot of the times, these more progressive congressional candidates, for example, will campaign with, even more moderate Democrats statewide. And so unless they're specifically not doing that, it's quite easy for Republicans to make that argument. I think this is really something we've seen for the better part of 10 years in the Trump era, is just this nationalization of politics. Trump himself has said, I think last week in the White House, in the Oval Office, he said something like, well, people aren't unhappy with me, they're unhappy with Republicans. And so he's kind of putting himself on the ballot to try and help out some of these candidates, but also distance himself from some of them at the same time, which is a little different, I think, from what he's done before, where he's just, said, if you want Trump, if you want the Trump agenda, back XYZ candidate in XYZ state.
This is Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM. Today we have on Victoria Churchill, U.S. political reporter for the Daily Mail, here to talk about her recent coverage of the Michigan election results and what senatorial candidate Abdul El-Sayed's victory means for this fall's election. And now what do you think it is? Because this seemed to be a big part of your argument about why El-Sayed's victory is going to kind of be favorable for the Republicans. What do you think it is about El-Sayed's politics that's going to make it difficult for him to pull together this broader coalition to be able to have this victory against Rogers?
Well, a big part of it is just being more of that progressive voice. So one of the women that leads the Democratic Socialists of America, she's been doing media hits kind of talking about the positions in their platform, which on one hand seem, frankly pretty radical, right? Things like abolish the Senate, completely change the way that presidents are elected and things like that. But also when the socialist leaders, Democratic socialist leaders, are asked about their policy positions, like, tax the rich, their answer is just tax the hell out of them. And then when they're probed on, well, how would you do that? Or what would that percent be? They don't really seem to have substantive, backing, like with numbers and with facts for a lot of their broad-based ideas. And I think this really translates well to El-Sayed because he had like 3 chants that he was reciting throughout the course of his campaign. One of them not taking money from corporate donors, like I mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also had others. But the other things I want to point out with El-Sayed, that they were get money out of politics, put money in your pocket, and Medicare for all.
Mm-hmm.
So he just kept reciting those 3 parts of his campaign message, whether that was in rallies, whether that was in in ads and things like that, in social media posts. So there's really the consistent messaging. But a lot of the times these just seem like very, very broad policy points. And, again, when he's probed and asked about them, he and others like him don't really seem to have very many specifics. And, one thing that I've pointed out both in my reporting and some of my commentary work as well is that he seems to be hypocritical on at least a couple of these points. So, on the Medicare for all point, his wife is in the medical field as well, and she doesn't take Medicare patients. He's, also said some not very favorable things about landlords, but his most recent financial disclosures showed that he has rental properties, not only in Michigan, but also overseas in India and in the Middle East. And so, it really seems like, particularly with a lot of these candidates, is that they want these rules for the general public, but not for themselves, right? They say rules for thee, but not for me. And that really seems to be the case. I think the more and more people look at not only his rhetoric, but also his record and just very tangible things that he owns and that his family members do. And, even though he does have that no corporate money pledge or that get money out of politics, his biggest donor for a PAC that's aligned with him is also his father-in-law, who has contributed, significantly over the single person contribution limit for political campaigns as well. And so, again, all these things, he seems to find a way to weasel around them.
This is Radio Free Hillsdale 101.7 FM. We have on Victoria Churchill, U.S. political reporter for the Daily Mail, here to talk about her recent coverage of the Michigan election results. And now I was wondering, like, if you had a read as far as like what role did kind of younger voters play in his victory, especially as you can kind of think about like what like if El-Sayed's win is indicative of like his kind of coalition becoming the future of the Democratic Party. Like, do you see younger voters maybe like making the future of the Democratic Party more swinging towards that progressive rather than the moderate establishment Democratic Party?
Absolutely. I mean, you've hit the nail quite squarely on the head where, younger voters are backing these more progressive candidates. And then on the other hand, you have your more moderate Democrats, your older voters typically backing the more establishment or more moderate candidates. And again, I think we see this not only in the electorate, but also in the candidates. A lot of these victories have been generational. So, for example, when you look at this Colorado victory that I mentioned earlier, the candidate that won there, she has been alive as long as her opponent has been in office. And that's a story that we keep seeing time and time again with these more progressive candidates really making their case. And, of course, I think at least nationwide, the start of this was definitely AOC. And, she herself was on national TV this weekend. She was on ABC this week, and she mentioned, people like me basically like aren't the fringes anymore. We're not like a ragtag band of revolutionaries was kind of along the phrasing that she used. And, really showing that her segment of the party really has power, staying power, but also, is really the future of the party.
And then I was wondering kind of like, what do you think voters should be kind of watching for between now and November that will tell us like which way the race is moving?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because so we do our own polling at Daily Mail, and we have shown through our own polling that Democrats are up on the generic ballot, but I've also done reporting that shows that Republicans are raising significantly more money nationwide. And so I think it's really for Republicans, they need to go out and make the case by case where, it is Abdul El-Sayed versus Mike Rogers, or it is, somebody like a Ken Paxton who, we've reported on plenty of his own problems down in Texas versus James Tallarico. And so it really is going to come down race by race for the strategy of what will win. And again, I think for Republicans, the best that they can do is to tie whoever they have to the most radical person that they associate with. So, is it AOC coming out to support El-Sayed? Is it Mamdani holding a rally for somebody in Wisconsin? Those are all things that Republicans are going to try and pin and place and, keep going for Democrats after over and over again to really tie the Democrat candidates to the most radical wings of their party. But, I think the Democrats are going to try and make that argument as well, right? Like, given that we do show polling that they are up on the generic ballot, that people do have kind of record levels of dissatisfaction with President Trump, I think mainly due to the Iran war and how long it's gone on.
Yeah.
That Democrats are going to be making that argument on the other side of, well, we have, a president that is historically unpopular, or he's never had approval ratings this low. The Republicans, despite that, are approving everything that he wants, particularly in the House. Like the Senate has blocked quite a few things, but in the House, Republicans are pretty much voting along with what Trump wants his agenda to be. And so Democrats are going to make that case of, well, gas is up. We're at war. This war was supposed to be over forever ago. We're fighting a war at least on two fronts, right? Because we've got Middle East, we've got Russia, Ukraine, which Trump has tried time and time again to resolve. He met with Putin early on in his second term. He met with Zelensky at the White House just a few weeks ago for, when Zelensky was in town for Lindsey Graham's funeral. So, Democrats are saying, this Trump is the ultimate deal maker and he's not making deals in the second term. So, that's going to be a very valid argument that they're going to take to their voters as well.
As you mentioned, this idea that, like people on both sides of these state elections are going to use this strategy of holding up their candidate as the alternative to this radical candidate on the other side of the aisle. What about Mike Rogers' platform makes him a great opponent to Abdul El-Sayed?
I mean, again, I think for Rogers, it's going to be quite an easy argument that, El-Sayed has these radical ideas and he doesn't have a way that he thinks that they're going to accomplish them. But, on the flip side, we are seeing that, again, Republicans are going to be having a tough time being tied to Trump. For Rogers, that's a little bit less of an issue because he hasn't been in politics for a couple of years, even though he is a known entity kind of before his time away from politics. So, it's definitely going to be a really interesting race. And, it was even interesting hearing there's a clip going around of Kamala Harris pretty much encouraging Democrats to have elections that are, too big to rig, basically encouraging turnout and saying that there pretty much should be no doubt on election day who wins, whether it's one way or another. And that was actually rhetoric that we heard coming out of the Trump campaign, particularly in 2024, is that, they didn't want weeks and weeks and weeks of ballot counting and nail biters, particularly in these swing states. And, if you think back to 2024, that's what we had. Like some of these swing states were decided very early on in the evening, and people knew the result of the election, long before they went to bed and long before polls closed, really, in some parts of the country, because there was just not enough electoral votes for Democrats to pick up.
Well, thank you so much for joining, Victoria. It was great having you. Thanks for all your insights.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Always great to chat.
Our guest has been Victoria Churchill, reporter for the Daily Mail, sharing about her recent coverage of the Michigan election results. And I'm Siobhan Weed on Radio Free Hillsdale, 101.7 FM.